Alright, section 3, the story. I just wanted to tell my story briefly, and then I will tell it again while contributing my evidence. My grandfather died in his early 70s from congestive heart failure, and my father died in his late 60s from the same thing. They both chose to sit in bed or a chair just waiting for that moment to leave this life. My sister was diagnosed with irregular heartbeat shortly after my dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the early 2000s. I also have a brother who, after ignoring his rapid heartbeat for nearly a decade, ended up with cardiomyopathy. I take my heart health very, very seriously. I have had very few palpitations before I was exposed to the refrigerant. I first noticed them when I was 14 or 16. I can't really remember when, but they were only one a month, if that, and all they ever were was a momentary awareness of something, nothing like head rushes or dizziness ever. As I've gotten older, and yes, the heavier I've gotten, I've had more palpitations. The most I had before all this would have been a couple a day, maybe. I never had to seek medical help before for it, and while my blood pressure was always high on initial readings, 145/85 at my immigration exam, for example, I could bring it down if left alone for a few minutes while sitting in a chair. It wasn't enough to concern the immigration doctor. I worked for this company for about a year as full-time and then another year as a temp. I was offered a job as a freon disposal technician. At first things were fine, but then they ripped the rollers out and all of a sudden I was doing everything off the floor. After some time I realized that I was experiencing an increase in palpitations. Eventually, after month 4 or 5, it started to progress to heart racing and thumping. After my supervisor discovered a leaking R12 reclamation machine and I attempted to get help for what happened, it progressed into anxiety and ultimately a panic attack, supposedly. I believe the anxiety and stress from everything only made it that much worse, and that triggered something. When I couldn't get help, I quit my job. I was told the same thing over and over. Freon cannot cause a regular heartbeat and that I did not have it. I spent from February to October before I was given proper medication. The only thing that anyone would give me was blood pressure medication. When I asked for a beta blocker, I was told several times that beta blockers are bad and that I did not want them. I immediately quit and started looking for a new job after I realized I wasn't going to get help. I had no other choice. I spent the next couple months working temp jobs, trying to convince myself that I would get better on my own. I tried several times to get my doctor to help me. I eventually had a chance at easily the best job I have probably ever had here, and the job involved night shifts, which is when the irregular heartbeat would happen the most. When I told my doctor if he didn't do something I was going to lose my job, he doubled my dose of blood pressure medication instead. I lost my job shortly after that. At that point I had to face reality of what my life was going to be like if I didn't get help. At this point, after months and months of the high blood pressure, I started to develop multiple eye floaters. I started having kidney pain. I was in extreme mind fog. I felt like I was dying, and I most likely was. I was given a Holter on October 1st, and my doctor looked me square in the eye after getting the results and told me that what I was experiencing was normal sinus function. I almost had a mental breakdown. I seen another doctor at the same clinic who I'd seen before who went ahead and prescribed me beta blockers after he initially told me he didn't want to interfere with the other doctor's diagnosis. This stopped most of the palpitations immediately, and my blood pressure started to come down as a result. It took many months before the brain fog began to clear, and I still feel like my brain is still recovering slightly from this. The eye floaters eventually turned into squiggly lines, not enough to worry about. I still take some medication. I had to take it every day at first, but eventually after a couple years I managed to wean myself off for the most part. However, I am still somewhat sensitized to adrenaline, something I've never had a problem with before I took this job, and I've experienced a lot of anxiety, pain, and suffering in my life. I filed my report officially with WCB in 2019 for at least an apology or recognition and some help. And yes, my missed income from that time that I waited to be diagnosed as well. Even though I know I'm entitled to more than that. I know I'm entitled to missed income up to the point that I stopped taking medication. Recently my blood pressure has been high again. I didn't really know until I was told by a doctor that he couldn't take me on as a patient after I waited a year on the doctor's wait list because he would feel bad if something happened to me. I imagine it has to do with the stress and anxiety of dealing with WCB and trying to decide what I'm going to do from this point on. I quit my last job because I was on the verge of throwing my back out after WCB B told me there was nothing I could do about their decision. That is fine, but if I cannot count on WCB to do their job, or the doctors for that matter, then I cannot allow myself to be put in situations that have a high chance of me being injured. Gone are the days of the physical labor overtime jobs that I've done most of my life, and I will most likely just stand behind a desk part-time for the rest of my time in this country. I will go into more detail of the story in another section. Alright, the work setup. Initially, the work area consisted of a roller system that would allow you to roll the units up to waist height, where the compressors could be easily tapped, drained, cut away, and unbolted. There was one reclamation machine with one yellow jacket hose hookup so that units could be drained one at a time. I would then drain the compressor of Freon and then cut off anything that was copper, like the dryer or the main line running up to the freezer that's easy to get to on most refrigerators. I would then remove the compressors and throw them in a separate box. There was a box for compressors, wiring, tubing, and dryers. This setup worked rather well, but then the bosses decided they wanted to have two machines, one for 134A and one for R12, so that they could resell the gas instead of disposing it, which was very costly. I was told to rip out the rollers and they would replace it with a better setup. Here in the shop picture you can kind of get a better idea. I made these mock-ups in a 3D modeling program. As you can see, it was not a very big space and I was kind of trapped in there with everything as well. And you'll notice the garage door, which was only cracked open. After removing everything and I come in the next day, everything was suddenly on the floor. There were two reclamation machines. Each one had a plyboard mounted to the wall with standard water tubing, like what you would see on a water dispenser or your refrigerator, connected by pressure fittings, as well as 4 hookups so that 4 units could be drained at the same time, which seemed to reduce the efficiency of the machine, in my opinion. I knew from my previous supervisor that yellow jacket tubing was required, but when I asked the bosses about it, they said that it was fine the way it was. At first, the water line would pop out of the pressure couplings once or twice a week, but towards the end, it was a near daily experience. Before continuing, I want to show an article called A Guide to Effective Refrigerant Recovery. An overview of the latest in refrigerant recovery technology includes a step-by-step guide to applying the 3 most commonly used recovery methods. There are a few exceptions for venting refrigerant that you should know. De minimis venting, which is probably the most well-known exception, simply means refrigerant that is released in good faith during recovering, recycling, or disposing of refrigerant. The other exceptions are as follows. Small releases of a refrigerant that are the result of purging hoses or from disconnecting hoses after a charge or service of equipment. The 3 different recovery methods are vapor recovery, which is the most common, which is what I was doing. For the vapor recovery method, the following describes the 10 steps for proper use of the vapor recovery method. Connect the hose with a low loss fitting on both ends to the discharge side of the recovery equipment. All I did was connect one hose to the low side of the system and then drain the refrigerant that way. Everything I did is what they showed me. Recovery tips from the author. Always use the shortest hose as possible. Using a 3/8 inch hose will greatly increase your recovery rates. Use a heat gun to get the refrigerant to boil off out of the oil that's locked up in the system. When comparing performance on websites, remember that vapor recovery is only approximately 75 to 80% of the recovery process. It is very important to use a recovery machine with a high vapor recovery rate. Liquid recovery is 20 to 25% of the recovery process. You will notice that vapor recovery only recovers 75 to 80% of the refrigerant. When I asked about why we didn't heat the compressors up with some kind of tool, I was told we didn't need to do that. When I would throw the compressors after unbolting and removing them, I would chuckle when the gas would suddenly be released by the physical force of the motion. I had no idea at that time that it was pulling on the ground where I spent most of my time wrestling the compressors out of rusted units. When pulling compressors out, I would tend to hold my breath because often Freon would discharge and blow in my face during the yank, and this was after smacking it with a hammer. I remember one day after smacking the units too loud, my supervisor come back to tell me to quit because I was making too much noise. All right, no one was taking my safety seriously then, and no one takes it seriously now. This is why I realize I cannot count on WCB to do the right thing if given the choice, and I will never allow myself to be put back in a situation like that again willingly. From day one of the new R12 reclamation machine, it had a very slight leak in it that grew bigger and bigger over time. To compensate for this, I would have to run normal air through the machine to push the refrigerant into the main tank. Because I was hitting my numbers, the bosses told me that there wasn't a leak. When I went on vacation for 2 weeks and my supervisor failed to recover any refrigerant, they admitted there must be a leak. Because of this, I would often have to bleed the main storage tank for R12 for oxygen and nitrogen, which is lighter than Freon and sits at the top of the tank. I was told as long as I don't disturb the tank and I watch the weight while having the valve open, that it would be okay. Looking back, this was incredibly dumb and stupid to do because there were no air quality sensors and there were never any air quality tests that were ever done. So if the machine would start leaking Freon and I succumbed to the fumes back there, that would be it. There'd be no coming back from that. On a side note, I actually made a complaint towards the labor board one day because after some time after quitting, I drove by there and the bay door was completely closed. The owner tried to do this to me one day, trying to save money on the heating bill right in front of my supervisor, and when I looked at him in a state of shock and told him that some kind of ventilation is required, he told me they don't do that in America. The labor board promised me they'd call me back and let me know what happened as a result of that complaint, and they just never did. Somewhere towards the end, as I had stated before, manual ventilation is required. There was no problem leaving the bay door halfway open during the summer or even the winter. The shop had a huge dual heater setup that allowed for adequate heating to make up for this, because the inside temperature has to be a certain temperature to get the most Freon out of the oil mixture. These huge blowers were ripped out and replaced by a tiny little blower, and when I asked about what to do about the bay door because I couldn't leave it halfway open anymore, I was just told to crack it instead. The owner did this to save money, and when my supervisor came out and discovered the R12 machine spraying out Freon one day, I was pretty much done. I was hoping to get unemployment at the very least, but when it became apparent I wasn't going to get any help, I did the only thing I could, which was quit. I truly believe had I stayed there just another few weeks that I would have had a heart attack or a stroke.